In August 1975, the world's deadliest dam failure occurred. The death toll dwarfs that of Hurricane Katrina, and depending on the estimates you use for long-term effects, likely surpasses those of the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters combined. As many as 230,000 people were lost, many in just a few hours. So why have most of us never heard of it? This is the story of the Banqiao Dam, a catastrophe on a biblical scale, and the chillingly successful campaign to erase it from history. And as we're about to see, the playbook used to bury this tragedy reveals a disturbing pattern that powerful institutions still use today to hide their failures from the public. Let's go back to the early 1950s, to China's Henan province. Under the new leadership of Mao Zedong, the country was fueled by an ambition to conquer nature and prove the might of communist will. A huge part of this was the campaign to harness the Huai River, and at its center was the Banqiao Dam. Built with help from Soviet advisors, it was supposed to be an engineering masterpiece, a symbol of progress that would finally tame the region's brutal floods. After its construction and a later reinforcement project, officials and the public had immense faith in the structure. They nicknamed it the Iron Dam, a name that captured its supposed invincibility. It was said to be designed to withstand a once-in-a-thousand-year flood, a storm so rare it felt like a statistical fantasy. But there was a fatal flaw, and it wasn't in the concrete or clay. It was in the political climate. The project was driven by ideologues who cared more about speed and scale than safety. A top hydrologist, Chen Xing, was one of the few who dared to question the plan. He warned that the design was flawed and that building so many dams in the basin without proper flood prevention was a recipe for disaster. For his scientific honesty, he was punished. In the political fervor of the era, warnings were seen as dissent. Chen was condemned with political labels like right-wing opportunist, removed from his post and silenced. His warnings were ignored. The Iron Dam stood as a monument to political arrogance, waiting for a storm the blueprints insisted couldn't happen. In early August 1975, that impossible storm arrived. Super Typhoon. Nina slammed into mainland China. As it moved inland, it stalled over Henan province and merged with a cold front. What happened next was a weather event of almost supernatural intensity, a once-in-2,000-year downpour. In some areas, more than a year's worth of rain fell in a single day. At the Banqiao Dam, the situation became desperate. The water in the reservoir was rising with terrifying speed. The storm had knocked out communication lines, so there was no way to coordinate with anyone downstream. The dam's sluice gates were partially blocked by silt and couldn't discharge enough water. The operators could only watch in horror. Just after 1 a.m. on August 8th, the rain briefly stopped, and an eerie calm fell over the dam. A survivor remembered someone shouting that the water level was finally going down. But seconds later, a sound like the sky collapsing and the earth cracking ripped through the night. The Iron Dam was gone. An estimated 600 billion litres of water, that's equivalent to about 240,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, erupted from the reservoir. This wasn't a flood. It was an inland tsunami. The wave, nearly 7 miles wide in some places and moving at 30 miles per hour, annihilated everything in its path. It set off a domino effect, toppling 61 or 62 other dams downstream. The town of Daowencheng was literally wiped off the map, and all 9,600 of its residents were killed. In the immediate aftermath, the horror was only beginning. The initial wall of water killed as many as 85,000 people almost instantly. But the water had nowhere to go, creating vast, stagnant lakes. Survivors were trapped for weeks on rooftops and tiny patches of high ground, completely cut off from rescue. Disease and famine began to spread like wildfire. The total death toll, including those who died in the weeks that followed, is estimated to be as high as 230,000. But the world heard nothing. The disaster happened during the political chaos of the Cultural Revolution, a time when any failure, especially a man-made one, was a state secret. The Communist Party immediately banned any and all media reporting. Journalists were forbidden from entering the region. The collapse of over 60 dams and the deaths of up to 250,000 people were reduced to a local rumor. For decades, the official story, when it was mentioned at all, was that the dam failure was a natural disaster caused by an unforeseeable act of God. The government completely ignored the critical roles of shoddy engineering, flawed design, and political pressure. The official death toll was stated as just 26,000, a number that tragically only accounted for those killed directly by the flood, erasing the vast majority who died from the famine and plague that followed. The full story stayed buried for decades, locked away in secret government archives. It's tempting to write this off as a story that could only happen in an authoritarian state. But this playbook for erasing disaster, this deliberate act of burying a catastrophe to protect the powerful, isn't unique to China at all. It makes you wonder, why do some of the deadliest disasters in history vanish from our textbooks, while others, like the Titanic or Chernobyl, become global legends? Take the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia, which started in 1930. It's been called America's worst industrial disaster, yet it remains almost unknown. A subsidiary of Union Carbide was drilling a 3-mile tunnel for a hydroelectric project. The company discovered the mountain was full of nearly pure silica rock and decided to mine it while they tunneled, but with a horrifying disregard for human life. The workforce was made up of nearly 3,000 men, most of whom were poor African-American migrants looking for any paying job in the Depression-era South. They were forced to use dry drilling techniques in confined spaces, which filled the air with a thick, choking cloud of silica dust, a substance known to cause the fatal lung disease, silicosis. The men weren't given protective masks. Survivors said the dust was so thick you could practically chew it. Within months, workers started dying from what the company dismissively called tunnelitis. Conservative estimates placed the final death toll between 764 and 1,000 workers, though some historians believe the real number was far higher. The cover-up was just as brutal. Company officials had bodies buried in unmarked graves to hide the death count. They used racist narratives in the press, blaming the deaths on the workers' supposed poor habits. When lawsuits were filed, Union Carbide denied everything. Ultimately, the existing legal framework and statutes of limitation were used to make it nearly impossible for most victims to get any real compensation, effectively erasing the disaster from the legal and historical record. From the plains of China to the mountains of West Virginia, a clear pattern for making a catastrophe disappear emerges. First, you have to protect state and corporate legitimacy. Disasters expose incompetence. For the Chinese government, the Banqiao failure shattered the myth of Maoist engineering superiority. For Union Carbide at Hawks Nest, admitting fault meant lawsuits, new regulations, and a ruined reputation. The same was true for the Soviet Union. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster became infamous because its radiation crossed international borders, forcing the government to admit it happened. But the Kishtim disaster of 1957, a massive nuclear waste explosion that contaminated thousands of square miles, was successfully hidden for over 30 years. It happened in a secret city, Chelyabinsk 40, which didn't even appear on maps, allowing the state to simply deny its existence. Second, and perhaps most cynically, is racial and class bias. History remembers who it's told to remember. Disasters that mainly affect poor, marginalized communities are far easier to ignore. At Hawks Nest, the victims were mostly poor black men, whose lives were seen as disposable and whose suffering was literally buried. Third is the control of information. In authoritarian states like China and the USSR, this is done with blunt state censorship. But in democracies, the methods can be more subtle. Corporate PR campaigns that muddy the waters, gag orders on whistleblowers, and political pressure that discourages investigative reporting. And finally, if you can't hide the event, you either reframe the narrative. Banqiao was recast as an unavoidable act of God, not a failure of man. The focus is shifted away from the causes and onto stories of heroic rescues and rebuilding, a classic tactic that deflects blame and promotes national unity. The full, horrifying story of the Banqiao Dam only began to crawl into the light in the 1990s, when some internal reports were published. More official documents finally became publicly accessible around 2005, a full 30 years after the event. These stories aren't just historical footnotes, they are warnings, Forgetting them doesn't just dishonor the dead, it makes the next disaster more likely. The same pressures that led to Banqiao, of putting profits and political goals ahead of scientific warnings, are still with us. We see it in debates over aging infrastructure, corporate deregulation, and the growing threat of climate-driven catastrophes. When governments and corporations are allowed to bury their mistakes, they are given permission to repeat them. These histories were erased because they are inconvenient, and that is precisely why they must be remembered. If you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe for more historical deep dives that challenge what you think you know.